This is the Rat Camp Podcast. I'm Tim Harden. This is new. It's a new episode. It's the first episode. It's a new podcast. We'll be joined in this episode by Rick Matney of Wild Game Chef. As some of you may know, I'm the host of the Venturing Angler podcast, and in a similar format and for some of the same reasons, I'm fortunate to be able to spend a lot of time with some of the most skilled and accomplished people in the outdoors world. I'm a hunting enthusiast, and I get to spend a lot of time with people whom I respect a great deal, both for their accomplishments and their opinions. For that reason, I want to preserve some of these conversations for myself, but also I think there's an audience that might be interested too. And so let's kick things off, episode 1 with Rick Matney of Wild Game Chef. All right, we're here with Rick Matney from Wild Game Chef. Rick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tim.
So we had a great conversation last night, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to revisit the conversation for a recorded podcast on mismanagement between public and private land in the West. One of the triggers, I think, for the conversation last night was both of us recognizing that you see a lot of immature 4x4 mule deer posted on social media a lot these days, and how that ought not to be happening because of the implications or the consequences on deer in the West, and also what it means for our deer moving forward. So I'd love to sort of redo the conversation and have an audience hear some of your thoughts on this. And so what are some of the things you're seeing that are bothering you, and what do you think the impact is?
Well, we're going to start with the stereotypical 3.5-year-old, 150-inch 4x4 mule deer that gets shot in Montana. You see a lot of these. They pop up on most people's social media feeds, and everyone says, oh, it's a great buck. It's a nice one, 4x4, and all this other stuff. And to me, it's a slap in the face for conservation and for any serious hunter, because that's the worst animal, and in my opinion, that a hunter could take. And there's a lot of big name people out there that are shooting these things. It's not just, kids and first time hunters that are killing them. There's seasoned hunters that go out, and that's the deer that they decide to take. And it's kind of widely accepted that that's okay, and that's a great deer because it's on public land. And the idea that it's on public land, and the fact that if I don't shoot it, the next guy will, has got to stop. It's something that I hear all the time, and it's like, well, if I let him go, the next guy's just going to shoot him. And, that might be true, but you don't hear anyone from the Midwest saying that, in Illinois, when they let go a nice 10-point, 3.5-year-old whitetail that comes by their stand in their food plot in their farm, whatever, that's the buck that they let go every time. And no one flames them for that. Everyone promotes that. And, by passing that deer, and people say, oh, I passed a nice 3.5-year-old 10-point, he just wasn't old enough. You get praised in the Midwest for that. And the question I have is, why does that not carry over to public land in the West? You don't hear a lot of guys, oh man, you passed up 150-inch 4x4 on public land. That's awesome. Good job. You don't hear that praise anymore. Most of the time that deer gets shot, first of all. And second of all, it seems like there's a dissident or some sort of disconnect between managed private land deer and public land deer. And really, there's no reason to have a different set of rules for public land deer versus private land for your own personal type of stature, or where you're going to be at with what you think is an animal that's okay to take. I think it should be just universal, whether it's public land out west, private land down in Texas, wherever it is, you should have a level of standard that is at least somewhat equal coming across the board. So just because it's on public land out west doesn't mean you should take an animal that you wouldn't normally take somewhere else. And I think that needs to be said. And almost the internet's basically glorified the taking of these 3 and 4-year-old, deer that haven't reached full maturity yet. They're not a trophy by any means, but they're a trophy to that person who shot it. and it's a trophy on their Instagram page. It gets a ton of likes. People from Florida looking at a 150 inch 4x4 mule deer are like, oh man, that's a nice one, and they just, compared to what they're used to, they're not used to seeing something with that kind of antlers on it. So they just don't know. And it's an interesting kind of dilemma that you come up with, because, myself personally, every deer season, I let a pile of deer go that are young up and comers that look great. And literally half the time I watch them get shot behind me by the next person. It happens all the time. And it's frustrating. And it's like, okay, good for them. That's their biggest deer. And I was like, that's great. But, just because it's the biggest antler deer that you've shot thus far doesn't mean it was the right deer to take. The trophy is a lot more than the antlers, in my opinion. The trophy is the hunt, and it's finding an animal that's smart. It's tricking a mature one, things of that nature. And you know what? If you can't trick a mature one and you don't find, that trophy deer that you're looking for, there is nothing wrong with shooting, a poorly genetic management deer. And one thing that you have to consider, every time you take an animal, you have basically two effects of that animal. So you have the effect of getting that animal out of the gene pool, and then the effect of either the effect of not passing on its genes. So by killing one buck, you do more than killing just that one deer. You also kill the possibilities of him breeding. That being said, by letting a deer go, not only do you not kill that deer with good genetics, but you gave the possibility of breeding a bunch of does as well. So the effect is more than just one animal. It has a longer reaching effect. So by shooting the 3.5-year-old, 150 inch typical deep forked 4x4 in Montana, you've not only taken that animal out of the gene pool, but you took all of what he could have bred out of the gene pool as well. So it's a bigger effect. So that needs to be said, and I think people need to understand that. And it can't always be for the gram. I love trophy hunting mule deer. It's one of my favorite things to do. I personally have a rule. I won't shoot a buck unless it's bigger than the one that I have on the wall, or it meets my cull criteria. My cull criteria is any deer older than 6 years old, and then any deer with poor genetics older than 3 years old. So by having that kind of standard, the younger deer in the 1.5 to 2.5-year-old range, they haven't had enough time to know if they're going to be decent forked deer or not. You kind of need them to get to see if they're going to be 3x3s for mule deer, if they're going to be 4x4s, so you got to give them enough age to get to there to see where they're going to go from there. Once they're 3.5 and they're a 3x3, the chances of them growing another fork and being a 4x4 are slim to none. So at that point in time, that's a deer that's undesirable. And by killing that deer, you have a double positive effect. You get that one out of the gene pool, and as well as anything he may breed down the line as well. So, there's so many 3x4s and 3x3s running around in public land in Montana, and everyone's bitching about, oh, where are the 4x4s? Well, they all got shot. Because every single young 4x4 gets shot before it has a chance to get bigger, and everyone passes and leaves the 3x4s or the 3x3s. It's like it's the first thing they do is pass on a 3x3. That's what they pass on. And I think the idea of passing on a 3x3 needs to be recircled back. We need to rethink where we're going with this. I don't think that that's what we want to do.
One of the things I've noticed too is that these deer that you're describing that we're seeing harvested in mass are I'm seeing them on Instagram pretty early in the season too.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they're the ones that get shot first. It's people have an idea of what they want out of a deer, out of a buck in Montana when they come here on a public land hunt. And it's your standard deep forked 4x4 with eye guards, mule deer, and if those ones get killed early in the season, which most of them do, they're not around to breed later in the season either, and there's a negative effect to that as well. And it doesn't matter when they get killed in the year. It's just most people won't pass up that deer, but they'll pass up a 140-inch 3x3. And in my opinion, a 140-inch 3x3 is a much better deer to take than a 150-inch 4x4. Not a lot of difference as far as the rack size and score and everything else, but because it doesn't have 4 points, it's not desirable for the internet. but that's got to change. If someone were to go around shooting a bunch of 10 point 3.5-year-old whitetails on a Texas ranch or somewhere in the Midwest, really anywhere, they'd get flamed for it. They'd be like, oh man, why didn't you let that one grow? Why didn't you let that one go? Why'd you take that one? And so it's in the whitetail community, it's accepted that you're shooting for better genetics. You're managing your deer herd, and a lot of that's because it's mostly private land and you can control those aspects of it. But that doesn't mean that public land should be treated any differently than private land. If we all jumped on the same bandwagon and said, okay, we're not going to shoot these genetically desirable younger deer when they're 3.5 and 4.5, we're going to wait for them to get some age on them and shoot, only 5.5 and older deer. And we're going to start taking out some of the genetically undesirable deer, like your 3x3s, for instance, or your big 2 points, big old 2 points. And, I think that we can get there as a hunting community, but right now the glory of the Instagram 150-inch mule deer shot is so strong that it's going to take a lot of people, especially big name people that are big in social media and on the hunting shows and other things like that, to break that stigmata to where, it's public land. If I don't shoot it, someone else will. Well, that's not totally true. There's lots of stuff that, I don't shoot, and I know lots of other people that won't shoot it as well. And so there's a few people that would shoot it, but there's a bunch that won't. And I know that number of experienced hunters that love hunting deer, those are not the guys that are shooting the 4x4 150 inchers. I mean, everyone's done it. The first couple deer they see out west, it's hard not to. You see it, it's bigger than anything else you're used to, so you want to shoot it. And I get that. But I mean, just with a little bit more time and looking and watching the animal, trying to get a good idea of how old and mature that animal is, look for the swayed back, look for the Roman nose, look at the face. Just looking at the face of a mule deer, it's fairly easy to tell if it's a young deer or not. Once they get from 5 years old and up, it's hard to tell how old they are. But a 3-year-old deer, not hard at all to tell. Look at the size of their body compared to the does that are with them, or a smaller buck that's with them. It's a forked horn or something. It's a 2.5. These are all things that us as hunters need to be educated in, and it's our responsibility to have an education on how to age a deer properly, just as you would shot placement. I mean, I think aging deer is just as important as knowing where to shoot a deer. And that's something that they don't teach and you don't talk about too much. It's like, oh, well, we age the deer. We have them on trail cams for this many years and this and that. And there's all kinds of excuses of why you can't do it. And it's hard. It's not easy. And you're going to be wrong sometimes. But as long as you have a fairly good education base on that, it helps you transcribe that into your hunting career and your hunting to make yourself a much more effective and useful tool to the deer herd. I mean, it's, management. That's what we're doing here. Hunting's for sport. It's for management. There's a lot of reasons to hunt. But I feel like Western private land or public land hunting is taking a turn for the worse, and we're glorifying the killing of younger, basically genetically desirable specimens. And it's not the case elsewhere for whitetail and other places in the country. I don't understand the double standard why we have it for public land out west.
There's several things that you mentioned there that I want to follow up on. One is how do you think people ought to go about educating themselves?
I mean, the internet, believe it or not, has got more stuff on it. You can look at pictures from deer. There's all kinds of different operations in Mexico and places where they have pictures of bucks from 1 through 7 years old, their whole life cycles. And you can look at pictures from one to the next. You can see the progression of their body type, what they look like, the barrel chest. I mean, you can start seeing those characteristics and just looking at pictures of known age deer on the internet. And that'll transcribe into when you see them out in the field. It's just a lot of it's going to be experience. But luckily with this day and age, you don't need to go look at, several hundred deer out in, the Badlands of Montana to be able to have a good idea what a mature deer is and what an immature deer is. You can do that from home on your computer and get a pretty good idea. And it'll transcribe across to when you go on your hunt, out west. And then it's like, okay, that one doesn't have a swayed back. He's really short. He's barely bigger than the doe he's next to. That's going to be a 2.5 or 3.5 year old deer. There's a big difference between them. Once you see a 6-year-old deer in the wild, there's no doubt in your mind of how old that deer is when you're comparing it if there's another deer near it. Now, if it's a lone buck by itself, it's going to be a lot harder. It's much easier to judge them if there's another buck with them or another doe with them. And that's just how that works. So it's something that all hunters, I think, can do. Sit down for 10 minutes, before after you eat dinner or whatever, and just roll through a bunch of known age deer pictures and see the characteristics. Look at their faces, look at the spine on their back, how it sways. Look at their chest, how broad it is, how deep does it look, how close to its elbows. There's a lot of different ways to age a deer that will help you make that decision on whether that's a mature animal, whether it's the right animal to take or not. And that goes for antler growth as well. 3x3 mule deer, not desirable. Chances are if he's 3.5 years old or older, he's going to be a 3x3 the rest of his life. That's a great deer to take out of the deer herd. Somebody who shoots that deer and posts it on social media should be praised for taking that animal out and not killing a 4x4, 3.5-year-old deer. But unfortunately, right now, all you see is people, beating their chest and getting praised for shooting the 3.5-year-old 4x4. It's like that's been what the standard is. It's like that's where you want to start. If you can't start there, you're not anywhere. Why would you shoot a 3-point? And I think we need to change the script on that.
How do we change the script? So, one of the other things I was thinking about, we hunted as a kid in Maryland, and the deer that we dreamed about seeing after the summer when we saw them are deer that no one would shoot anymore. And so there was a shift that happened there. And part of that was, new regulations, but we're a border state here in Montana, and looking up north, it's part of the culture that you would pass on the deer that are, Instagram candy now. And those mule deer in Canada are enormous. And so there's different things happening that are showing success that's not present here. What do you think it's going to take, especially with an increase in hunters?
Well, you touched on one thing we need to talk about too, is you need to know what a trophy deer is for your area as well. So, using a specific area to be like, okay, this is a trophy deer. As far as when you're in that category and when to shoot one. Alberta, Saskatchewan, they're both limited draws, limited entry. They control their hunting pretty strict, and even their public land outfitting and other things that they have up there, it's pretty much universal that you just flat out don't shoot a non-mature deer up there. And if you do, it's going to be a 3-point or something with bad genetics. And by that, you look at their herds and they have some phenomenal genetics that have been passed on. They have extremely healthy herds with big, strong deer. The average antler size up there is significantly larger than what it is just south of the border in Montana here. And you look at what that's the result that we could have here if everyone jumped on board. But again, what's a trophy? A trophy is in the eye of the beholder. To certain people, a trophy means one thing and a trophy means another. What I think we need to do is we need to standardize what a trophy means. So I don't think a trophy should be standardized as, it's my biggest deer, so it's a trophy. If that deer is a 3.5-year-old good genetic deer, to me, that should not be considered a trophy. A trophy would be something that's old, that's had age, regardless of what its antler size is. It's something that's made it past a long list of predators and made it through 6 or 7 winters. That's a trophy. And so we kind of need to understand what that is. And likewise, you go to different areas and what's considered a trophy is different. So you go down and shoot a Coues deer in, Arizona, a 3x3 Coues deer, that's considered a trophy. You find a 5.5-year-old deer down there that's it's small antler, that's a trophy. So antler size is not a good bearing of what a trophy should be considered. I don't think we should use antler size as being the number one factor in whether we take an animal or not. I think both age and is it a good genetic representation of the species or not? If it's not something that's genetically desirable for that species, then it's an animal that should be taken. Likewise, if it's one that doesn't have the age on it. And I know that's tough. Finding a mature mule deer on public land in at least the state of Montana anyways, is almost an impossible feat. And I get how it can be daunting. But just because you can't find a mature buck that's in trophy status doesn't mean you can't do the whole herd good by taking out a younger deer with poor genetics. By then you're still helping the herd and you're still increasing your chance of finding that trophy deer at another season later on in life. I shot a really nice deer this year. I have a rule. It's got to be bigger than the one I have on the wall. I finally found one. The deer was 9.5 years old, and it took me 14 years to find one. So it's not something that comes around. They don't call them deer of a lifetime for nothing. They're not trophies if you shoot one every year. And the idea that every 150-inch deer is a trophy needs to go away, because that's not a trophy. And in fact, that's the worst animal you could take. And you need to be shunned for that, not praised for it. Right now, the internet's praising you for it. And there needs to be a little bit more awareness of what we can do as hunters to improve the deer herd, even if we can't find the trophy, the one we're looking for. And it's like, oh, it's the biggest one I saw this year. Well, that's not a good excuse. It doesn't have to be the biggest one you saw is the one you shot. That shouldn't be something that gets said. It's like, it's the same thing if it's on public land. Well, if I don't shoot it, the next guy will. Not an acceptable excuse. It really isn't. These should not be things that you say on the regular that are accepted. They wouldn't be, back in the Midwest on a deer farm back there, or on a property back there. Why are they acceptable out west here on public land? And so we just don't hold ourselves to the higher standard that a lot of the private land hunters do. And I think that's wrong. I think we should. I think we're all public landowners. So basically we have the biggest private ranch of all. So it's our job to manage as such.
And I do want to point this out too. I saw photos of that deer. It's unreal. And when you sent me the photos, you said, don't share this with anybody. For you, it's not about the gram. And
no,
getting away from the, I need this for the gram kind of thing would be helpful for sure. But I have to point out, I've never seen you as excited about a deer as the one you got in Alaska this August, or September, one of the two, which was, not the one that would get your attention on the wall. It was a trophy for where it was, and you were pretty excited about it, and that's what it's all about, at least as far as I'm concerned too. Not that there's anything wrong with posting your animals on Instagram. It's just, if it's a race, I think, to get antlers on social media, then we're not doing anybody any favors. With respect to shooting deer and getting them out of, and by the way, you've been talking about trophies a lot. I mean, you are a meat guy first and foremost, so I want to point that out for people who
for sure,
who are wondering about that. I mean, you're all about the meat, and you shoot way more does than anything else. For those who are wondering then what they need to be looking for in poor genetic deer, what are some of the things that ought to be, signs for hunters who are, feeling inspired to maybe change some of their practices or help the population?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to look for as far as, you want to look for deer that are at least 3.5 years old, no matter what. Any deer that's 2.5 or 1.5, those are going to be your forked horns and maybe your small, little tiny 3 or 4 points, when they get to the 2.5 range, perhaps. They haven't had enough of their life for them to actually decide what they're going to be, antler wise. So any of those 2.5-year-olds, your 1.5, 2.5-year-old deer, you're going to want to let those ones go regardless. When you get to 3.5, that's your full size deer. That's a full grown deer. A lot of people are like, oh, it's a mature deer. Well, kind of. It's a mature deer if you consider it a 16-year-old. But a 16-year-old can still fuck up his life or make his life great. So you want to give him a chance. However, in that 3.5-year-old age class of deer, if you see a 3x3 main frame, no splits, nothing like that, in a mule deer, that's going to be a poor genetic deer. I mean, it's not the desirable 4x4 trait. Likewise, if you see one that's got like 6 on one side and 2 on the other, there's a good chance that one's never going to change either, and that could be a trophy deer for someone as well as being a great management deer. So just because it's a management deer doesn't mean it can't be huge as well. I had a friend of mine shoot a 2x2 mule deer that was 7.5 years old. That was an absolute giant. That was a trophy in my opinion. It was 145-inch 2x2. That's, to me, that is a trophy deer. It was a deer that had poor genetics, but also had the age. So, I mean, it fits the trophy category and the management category as well. And so you basically just need to look at a lot of pictures of what your quintessential deer would be for whatever species you're hunting, whether it's blacktail, coos deer, whitetail, anything like that. For whitetail, you want a 10-point or 5x5 or, in some cases a 4x4 with eye guards, depending on what region of the U.S. you're from. That's your quintessential deer. A lot of the 8 points or the 3x3s or 4x4s, all the same deer, depending on your region, those are going to be less desirable. However, a 2.5-year-old 8-point, there's a good chance that the next year when he's 3.5, he's going to be a 10-point. So you don't want to go shooting a whole bunch of 2.5-year-old 8 points trying to get them out of the herd, because you're going to be shooting your 10 points too. So again, it's important to learn age on a deer. Basically, I don't think any deer should be taken until it's 3.5 years old. That's as far as bucks go. Because you don't know what they're going to become until then. Once they get to there, you got a pretty good idea of what they're going to become, and then you can make either a management or a trophy decision from there on out. So,
if you were to give just one piece of advice to those who are thinking about their upcoming harvests or hunts in Montana especially, but in the Rocky Mountain West even, what advice would you give?
Enjoy your time looking at deer. Enjoy studying the deer. Take more away from the deer than just the rack and the meat out of the mountains. There's so much you can learn from watching deer. And I don't think people sit and watch deer enough. When they're hunting, it's like, oop, that one's not big enough, go to the next one. And they just move right away. They don't take the time to have a relationship with that deer and how it works and how it interacts with other deer, and they're not learning anything. So, I mean, the advice I can give anyone is enjoy your time in the woods. Just because it's not a deer you're gonna not take or shoot doesn't mean it's not a deer you can't enjoy. Watch what he does, how he acts with other bucks, and what he does chasing does or whatever else. You can learn a lot from the behavior of deer and watching them. That'll make you a better hunter in the long run, even if you choose not to take that deer. So my best advice is take something away from every encounter you have. It doesn't always have to be antlers and meat. It can be an experience. It can be some education. Watch where a deer beds down. See what it looks for. When the wind's blowing from this direction, what side of the slope do they go to? There's all kinds of things you can learn just from deer behavior and watching them, that if you just skip over immediately and just go, oh, I'm not going to shoot that one and go to the next one, that you'll lose. And I think the hunt needs to be more about the experience and what you can learn each time you go into the woods, more so than what you take out of the woods. Because what you take out of the woods is gone forever. And you got to remember that. So if you leave it in the woods, it's there. So make responsible choices with that in mind.
You can become a better hunter by not killing.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the best hunters I know don't kill anything. Literally.
I love it.
They're deadly, but they don't kill them.
Well, Rick, I appreciate this a great deal. I think this is a great way to kick things off, and thanks for your time. And for those who want to learn more about what you've got going on with Wild Game Chef, head over to wildgamechef.com, and then on social media to Wild Game Chef RM for Rick Matney on Facebook, and on Instagram at Wild Game Chef. Of course, it's a little bit ironic to end the conversation with talking about social media handles. However, there's some great recipes to be found there, and definitely some great food porn to get you pretty excited about upcoming hunts. Rick, thanks so much.
Thank you, Tim.